Okay, well, let's begin chapter 3, which is the physiology of human sexual responding. All right, so I thought I'd start with a little conversation about estrus. Obviously, this is not a human, but this is clearly a primate in estrus. Um, Human females wear clothing for one thing, so even if there were changes to their anatomy like this, it wouldn't be visible because we have clothes on. But also, if human anatomy doesn't change like this during periods of sexual receptivity. Um, you know, human females are receptive in all stages of the menstrual cycle, even in phases when they aren't fertile, which would be around ovulation. And so estrus is kind of a tricky word to use with humans because we don't have that period of time where the female will accept the male and is capable of conceiving, right? But we do have that estrus phase where females are more capable of conceiving and do maybe send off some cues that they are more capable of conceiving during this phase. I have a couple of videos that I've linked in our classroom, and so you can watch these from those links. This first one shows how females behave a little bit differently when they're fertile than they do when they're not. And this one actually shows us how men respond to chemical signals, odors that females put off when they're aroused. One of the comments, by the way, if you watch this video, one of the comments that one of the YouTube viewers made was, how could this possibly be an evolutionary benefit for men to become less discriminating about the physical attractiveness of potential partners when under the influence of copulence? And they make it sound like you're already having sex with the person when you detect copulence, and that would be the only context in which a man would be exposed to copulence. Well, there are a couple of things wrong with that logic. One is that, you got to remember that humans were once very much communal creatures who lived in shared structures, either caves or huts or whatever, and you'd have more than one reproductive age couple that might be engaging in sexual activity within that structure, and the rest of the group would know not to look or pay attention or whatever. But these chemical signals would be floating around in the hut, and maybe make it more likely that the males in the hut would look at the females around them and see them as attractive because they're under the influence of these copulants. The other thing is that after a woman has had sex, now she is secreting these copulants that could make other men more attracted to her or more attracted to the women that they're with if they detect these copulants. So it's so in modern day you could see how this still might affect people, men's in particular, decision making. So that's an interesting one to watch. And then also the role of testosterone in attractiveness and how dopamine can influence who we find attractive. So all of these kind of pertain to the basic issue of how we become aroused. So normally in class I show those one after the next, and then we get to the models of human sexual arousal. So, and by the way, all three of those videos come from a series that the Discovery Channel put on a number of years ago called The Science of Sex Appeal, and it's a really good series, and there's lots of bootlegged clips on the internet, so I'm able to use it. So the main theory that accounts for the changes that our bodies go through during sexual arousal comes from Masters and Johnson. And if you recall from chapter 1, they used clinical observation to actually study what male bodies go through and what females' body go through during arousal. They observed, they think, somewhere around 10,000 complete sexual response cycles. Most of those sexual response cycles were masturbation. So they would have an individual come to the lab. They would, if it was a male, they would put a penile strain gauge on their penis that would detect blood flow and dilation of the penis, and then if they were female, they would insert a vaginal plasmidograph, which was a device that could detect the presence of moisture and blood flow and temperature and things like that. They wrote a book called Human Sexual Response. They wrote another one called Sex and Human Loving, and another one called The Pleasure Bond. So they were very busy writing about what sex does for couples and how it keeps people together. Ironically, they got divorced in the 90s, so anyway. So what they found from their observations was what they call a four-phase model. A lot of modern psychologists, we call it the EPOR model because you can kind of remember it in a little bit of an anagram that way. Because you go through four stages: excitement, plateau, orgasm, and resolution. So if we look at the male sexual response cycle that's depicted here, most males followed the red line. They would go from, resting state on the left. They'd be provided with some kind of literature that might be erotic or whatever, and they would they'd start to enter the excitement phase. They'd reach a plateau phase where their physiology would sort of stay stable, and then all of a sudden they'd get this spike of their physiology that would accompany orgasm, and then most of them then would return to a resting state through a process called resolution. Now for some of the men that they observed, they would have a second orgasm before experiencing resolution. So despite what you might have heard in the past, men also can have multiple orgasms, and they did it back in the 60s when Masters and Johnson were observing all these response cycles. Now for females, things get a little bit more complex because there were some females that basically followed the male pattern where they went from resting state through an excitement phase, a period of plateau, which you'll notice in the female pattern tends to be longer than the male pattern, and then a spike of orgasm, and then a resolution phase. That's depicted in the red line. And then you see the ones that are similar to the males in the green line with a second orgasm and then resolution. But then there was this third pattern that was never seen in any of the males, which was where they would reach plateau and then just sort of stay there and never experience orgasm, and then have a longer, slower resolution phase. So there was a little bit more diversity in what Masters and Johnson saw among women than among men. Now let's get into the four stages and what goes on in our bodies during these four stages. So in the EPOR model, E stands for excitement. It kind of looks like we're doing some kind of weird cheer. E is for excitement. Yay! Okay, so what happens in excitement is first and foremost vasocongestion. Vasocongestion means increase in blood pressure, basically. And so you're going to get a bunch of blood, if you're male, pooling in the penis. Like I mentioned back in chapter 2, blood is allowed into the penis, and then there's this valve that prevents the blood from exiting. So that's going to cause erection. So you see the penis becoming erect. Remember when we talked about the scrotum, right? During arousal, the scrotal sac starts to tighten up and the testicles will elevate closer to the body. For the female, we're going to see that same kind of vasocongestion where the clitoral glands and shaft are going to increase. So instead of seeing just a small amount of the clitoris, you're going to start to see more of it during arousal. The labia minora will increase in size, and usually that'll cause them to separate from each other so that it starts to look not quite like this picture, but at least more like it. Now, if we look internally in the female, what you see is the inner 1/3 of the vagina will start to expand, and the vaginal walls will lubricate. So in that excitement phase is where we first start to see those changes. And you can see the clitoris swelling in this view also. For both, they will experience sex flush. I only had a picture there of a female chest for sex flush, but it happens to both sexes. So the nipple becomes erect. Superficial veins will become more visible, and there will be some swelling in the chest that makes generally pinkness, and everything seems puffier during excitement. Once you've passed through excitement, you can reach a plateau. P is for plateau. And so this is where you're sort of at your peak level of excitement and you stay there for a while. But there are still some changes. For example, the Cowper's gland is going to secrete its fluid at the end of the plateau phase, right before orgasm. Once you get to the plateau phase, it's a lot less likely that the erection will be lost, even if somebody knocks on the door or something like that. The corona, the head of the penis becomes very engorged. It's like the largest size that it's going to achieve. The testicles have pulled up as tight as they're going to get, and the scrotum becomes very thick because it's pulled all of its skin together and lifted the testicles up. For the female, the clitoral glands at this point actually retracts under the clitoral hood. So remember, I mentioned that before when we talked about circumcision, that for females, if you remove their clitoral hood, it actually makes sex less pleasant because normally when you're at your peak of arousal, the clitoris would retract out of the hood so you don't get direct stimulation on it anymore. The clitoris is erect and the labia minora darken, so they've previously swollen and now they've become more dark as more blood is accumulating there. And then there are these little openings on the side of the vagina opening, little tiny, they're really hard to see. They're almost like a little bit smaller than the urethra. And researchers had always wondered what the function of these glands were. And some had hypothesized that that was the source of vaginal lubrication. But thanks to Masterson Johnson and their very intimate videos and things, they discovered that the Bartholin glands actually secrete fluid during the plateau phase, right before orgasm. So if anybody has ever, I'll put this delicately, performed oral sex on a woman and noticed that the taste changes, it's because of the Bartholin gland fluids. It's actually a pre-orgasmic release. Now internally, what's going on is that the upper 1/3 of the vagina fully expands in a process called tenting. What that means is that the uterus has lifted up, and this picture doesn't depict it unfortunately, but the uterus lifts up and the upper 1/3 of the vagina expands so that there's a significant amount of space there. And, at the plateau phase, it's much less likely that the penis would actually be able to hit the uterus anymore. If a woman's uterus is being hit by the man's penis, it's a sign that she's not actually fully aroused, and so a little backing off and more foreplay can oftentimes cause that uterus to lift up and out of the way, and it's less likely to get hit. Of course, sometimes it'll get hit depending on whatever what would you call it, move that you're doing, right? The approach that you're taking. So sometimes it's hard to avoid hitting the uterus, but if you're doing like standard missionary style penetration, it shouldn't hit the uterus if it's fully aroused. It would lift up. Now this tenting effect causes this air pocket in the upper 1/3 of the vagina. And so some of you might know where I'm going with this, because sometimes air gets in and then it gets sort of forced back out, and it can make an embarrassing noise. Some people call it queefing, some people call it farting, but it's just a function of fully aroused vagina. It has more space to hold air that then could get forced out through the vaginal opening. Fun things you learn in human sexuality. Now, as far as sex flush, it continues to spread up the chest with further arousal. So once you're at the plateau phase, this sex flush could be reaching your clavicles, your collarbones. It really spreads out over the chest, and it usually starts to spread down the abdomen also. O is for orgasm. So during orgasm, the contractions of the scrotum and the vas deferens will propel semen out the penis. Also, contractions will occur in what are called the pelvic muscles. So the perineal muscles that are in the area between the scrotum and the rectum, those will be contracting. The rectum will be contracting. There's like just a general sense of all the muscles are sort of twitching and contracting, and they might actually extend out into other parts of your body, like your toes or your legs or your arms as well. Your fingers can twitch. And so those are contractions that accompany orgasm. Now for women, the clitoris is going to stay under the hood during orgasm, and you're going to get all those pelvic muscles contracting also. So you can kind of see that better in this picture, because you'll get the same structures contracting, the sphincter, the anal sphincter muscles, the urethral sphincter muscle, the vagina will contract, the outer part, not that upper third that tented, but instead the lower third. And then the most powerful source of orgasmic sensation for women tends to come from the contractions of the uterus. So for most women, if they have to have their uterus removed, which we'll talk about in another chapter, that's the biggest loss, is that they feel like their orgasms aren't as intense as they once were because so much of the sensation comes out of the contractions of the uterus. What's really interesting about male versus female orgasms, whoops, that's not what I wanted to show you, is that if you look at the written description that males and females give of what they experience when they're reaching orgasm, if you take out references to ejaculation, actually something exiting the body, but if you just focus in on the sensations, the experience, you really can't tell the difference between what a man has written and what a woman has written. The sensations are very similar because our bodies are made out of very similar things, and the muscles that are contracting are very similar. Masters and Johnson found that these muscles in the pelvic region pulse on average 8 to 12 times. This is very specific stuff. And that the average contraction is about an 8/10 of a second long. So orgasm can be pretty brief, but there's 8 to 12 individual contractions that each last just under a second, and it's the same pattern for both males and females. So they were really kind of blown away by how similar males and females are in this fact. Now, the issue of multiple orgasms, like I mentioned, they noticed that males and females both could have multiple orgasms, and the trick is that males who had multiple orgasm only ejaculated during one of the orgasms. So they either reached orgasm the first time, had these pleasurable sensations and things, and then had their actual ejaculation on their second orgasm, or vice versa. Some men could have an ejaculation on the first one and then have a follow-up orgasm that was that didn't include ejaculation. So the key thing that Masters and Johnson noticed is that men could have multiple orgasms, but they could not have multiple ejaculations. There's a refractory period that men enter that prevents a second actual ejaculation. So no matter how much stimulation happens, you can't ejaculate again within that refractory period. The refractory period varies in length. Part of it's dependent on age. Younger men have shorter refractory periods than older men. Some of it has to do with health. Men who have great blood flow and, healthy physiologies will be able to have a shorter refractory period, things like that. But every man has some length of time ranging from minutes to days between the ability to ejaculate again. For women, because most women don't ejaculate, we don't have this issue of a refractory period where you have to get your ejaculation mechanisms all in place again. So the multiple orgasm was seen more frequently among women, but not in all women. Which brings us to the issue of female ejaculation and what is oftentimes referred to as the G-spot. Our book seems to really believe in the G-spot, and it's still a topic of debate. It's not really clear that it exists, that all women have one, that it's the reason why some women ejaculate. It's just really not super clear. But I'm going to tell you what the hypothesis is. So the G-spot is short for Grafenberg spot, which is the name of the doctor who first identified it. So the G-spot is circled there in this diagram. It's like 1/3 of the way into the vagina, and it's on the front side. There are Skene's glands and erectile tissue that may be present in some women, and but not in all. And so some people call this a female prostate gland, and it may in fact be, remember back in chapter 2 when we talked about how we start from the same exact structures and some degenerate when in the absence of testosterone. So for a female who has Skene's glands, it's possible that she has an undegenerated prostate gland still there, right? That she didn't completely degenerate what normally would go away. They think they might be present in half to maybe 2/3 of women, but it's really hard to know because it's not something that's normally, well, first off, it's not even visible to the naked eye. You'd only know that you have them by having had, experiences with female ejaculation. So Pasteur in 2013 did a meta-analysis of studies that were examining the issue of female ejaculation. And meta-analysis is when you look across a bunch of studies and look for patterns. And what they found is that in these studies, between 10% and 54% of study participants reported having experienced female ejaculation. That's a pretty big range. Between 10% and just over half. I mean, that's a wide range. So we have to be a little bit concerned about that. Women reported having ejaculated out of their urethra as little as 1 milliliter, up to 900 milliliters of fluid. 900 milliliters is almost a liter, right? So that's a lot of fluid. So there's a wide variation from just a small amount of fluid coming out of the urethra to a really large amount. Some women report that the fluid comes out all at once. Some report that there will be bursts of fluid interspersed with more sexual activity and then another burst of fluid. One thing that researchers have known for a long time is that those women who do ejaculate a fluid that contains proteins that are very similar to what is in the male prostate secretions. So it kind of supports the idea that it's a female prostate, that it's an undegenerated male prostate gland. It seems like it is pretty unlikely to degenerate for so many women to possibly have one, right? Like it's a pretty common occurrence for it to still be present. The thing is, it's such a controversial topic because some doctors really believe that the women are misattributing where the fluid's coming from. Like they say, oh, you're just confusing vaginal secretions with something coming out of your urethra. But women who have had this experience report it absolutely feels like it's coming out of the same orifice that urine comes out of. And in fact, a lot of times they're worried that they've actually lost bladder control. The good news is that when a person is having in the plateau phase, usually the bladder can't release. So there's something that prevents that. So it's probably not urine. And they say that even if it is mixed with urine, it also has these additional proteins that you would expect to come out of the prostate. So it's a pretty interesting little structure. We don't know for sure. One thing I would like to point out, just FYI, is, it is not, sometimes when men find out that this exists, men who have sex with women, they find out that this exists and they become very goal-oriented and they want to find in their female partner this mysterious structure, and they think that, I think in the back of their minds they're kind of hoping that that female ejaculation would be evidence of sexual satisfaction as closely as male ejaculation is evidence of male satisfaction, and it's not quite the same thing. Some women who have ejaculated actually it makes them feel bad, like they don't like it, and some who think that maybe they could ejaculate, they can't because they can't just let it go. And I mean, for not everybody it's a pleasurable thing. So it shouldn't be like a goal that sex should never be goal-oriented. Let me just put it that way. It should never be goal-oriented. So that's my little spiel. We'll get to that later when we talk about intimacy and stuff. All right, our final stage in the 4-stage model is resolution. R is for resolution. So loss of erection, the blood starts to flow back into the regular bloodstream. Everything starts to return back to where it had been. And like I mentioned, men enter this refractory period after ejaculation where they cannot have another ejaculation, no matter how much stimulation. For women, everything, same thing. Blood's all flowing out. Everything's returning back to its normal places. Your sex flush starts to diminish, and there's a period of time where it takes to sort of return back to your normal, reasonably resting state. Now, not everybody agrees with Masters and Johnson's interpretation. Kaplan, for example, who was a sex therapist, not a researcher, she had a different approach. She was worried about people who had, disorders of desire, people who weren't interested in having sex. So she worked with people who had that problem. So you'll notice when she made the change to the EPOR model, her change was to take away the plateau phase, these biological aspects, and then the resolution, sort of the biological aspects, she thought, and focus in on the precursor, the desire. And so as a sex therapist, that kind of makes a lot of sense, right? Like, let's include that as another step in how we come to want to have sex. And then we begin to get excited, and then we reach orgasm, and then we recover. So for her, those were the 3 important steps that were worth including in her model. She's a much more recent researcher than Masters and Johnson, so obviously her model built on theirs or worked from theirs. So she added this, psychological component. There was another one that came after Masters and Johnson, which is Reed's erotic stimulus pathway theory. And again, you can tell he basically took the Masters and Johnson model and sort of relabeled things and focused in on what he thought was important. So we've got seduction. And again, that's kind of like Kaplan's desire, but he was making the argument that seduction is part of the evolutionary game we play as humans. That males need to feel the chase, and females need to feel the being chased, and so he called that the seduction phase. And then the sensations phase is sort of like the excitement phase, where you're going through all the stuff that starts to get you all turned on and things. And then the surrender phase, which ultimately will result in orgasm. And then he added this new term at the end here called reflection during the resolution phase. And he really thought that the key way to tell if a couple is in a healthy sexual relationship is what they do during the reflection phase. So if you immediately fall asleep, he didn't think that was as healthy as if you cuddled up and talked to each other and things like that. The way that the couple responds is really meaningful, he thought. So cognition. So those were the 2 models that came after Masters and Johnson, and you can tell that they have sort of a different goal in mind. Masters and Johnson were trying to explain the biology of what our bodies go through. They weren't trying to do sex therapy or anything like that. They were trying to describe what they were observing in their lab. Kaplan and Reed were trying to develop models that would help them in their therapy with people who were having sexual behavior problems. All right. Basson is a model that's really popular among gynecologists. This is the intimacy-based model for women. And so in this model, way more steps you can see. And it's interesting because for gynecologists, wouldn't you think they'd like the biological model of Masters and Johnson? But what they're looking at is like advice they could give their patients. And so Basson pointed out that for women, oftentimes there is the emotional intimacy that leads into being receptive to sexual stimulation. They notice that, of course, there's spontaneous sex drive, so they put that in the middle, that, sometimes women just are horny also and just feel like having sex. But for women who are in couples, a lot of times the emotional intimacy is a precursor to being receptive to sexual stimuli. Loving stuff from their partner is more likely to lead to sexual arousal when the woman is feeling intimate with her partner. So sexual stimuli with biologic inputs and psychological inputs can lead to sexual arousal. So the biologic inputs would be actually, touching and feeling and all those actual sensations. And then the psychological, letting yourself get into it, turning off your daily list of things to do, not being worried about distractions, not being worried about birth control, not worried about contracting a disease, these kinds of things. Psychologically being able to give yourself over to the arousal. And that's going to lead to further arousal and sex drive, which leads to more emotional and physical satisfaction in general, which leads the woman to feel more emotionally intimate with her partner, which makes her more receptive to sexual stimuli, and blah, 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 on and on. So, of course, they also point out that at any point in this circle, if you have a problem, it's going to ultimately have an impact on the relationship and the sex that the couple has. So if you're having an arousal problem, if you're having emotional problems with your partner, if you're any of those kinds of things, it's going to interfere with your receptivity and stuff like that. So this model is a pretty complex one, but it really is designed really to talk about just women's response cycle, and it's for giving advice from gynecologists to their patients. So, all right, I think that completes our basic arousal, our physiological responding issues. So I hope you enjoyed that.